Welcome to This Explainer. Look, we interact with the spaces we live in every single day, right? But we rarely stop to actually decode them. Today, we're going to explore how dramatic socioeconomic shifts, technological leaps, and sometimes just sheer necessity literally shape the architecture of New York City apartments. By looking at these specific floor plans and historical transformations, we can actually read the history of the city itself.
We've got a great roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the classic brownstone and the city grid, move into crowded tenements, and then see how elevators brought us the classic 6 layout. After that, we'll spend some real time focusing on the dramatic transition of manufacturing zones into ultra-elite lofts, before wrapping up with the surprisingly ironic origin of the studio apartment. Let's get going.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever wondered why New York apartments are so kinda weird? Like, why on earth are there bathtubs in the kitchen? Or why are mountains of trash bags always piled up right on the sidewalk instead of hidden in some back alley? Why do some spots feel like grand estates while others feel like you're literally living in a narrow train car? Well, the answers aren't random at all. They're deeply baked into the city's architectural DNA.
Part 1. The brownstone and the grade. To really understand NYC's unique spaces, we have to start with the mid-19th century brownstone row houses. You know the ones. They're built tightly together, sharing those thick party walls. But look at the number 20. In New York City, 20 blocks equals exactly 1 mile. And that's no coincidence. It's the direct result of the incredibly strict, unyielding math of the 1811 grid plan, which dictated exactly how these brownstones, and honestly, almost everything else, were built.
The city planners basically approached this like a giant math problem. Step 1, they took a 200-foot block. Step 2, they followed it with a 60-foot street and just repeated that pattern over and over. Then, they divided those 200-foot blocks in half to make 100-foot deep lots, and finally, they sliced those lots into 25-foot wide slivers. That 25-foot sliver, that's the fundamental building block of New York. But here's the absolute kicker. Back in 1811, people didn't produce much garbage. Food scraps just went straight to the livestock, so they didn't build back alleyways. That one single layout decision from over 2 centuries ago is literally why you still have to step around massive piles of modern trash right on the curbs today. There's simply no alleyway to hide it in.
And what about the famous brownstone stoop? Fun fact, stoop is simply a Dutch word for staircase. But these massive, grand staircases leading up to the parlor floor weren't just for showing off. Families actually used these elevated entrances for a very specific sanitary reason. They needed to step up and over the overwhelming amount of literal horse manure that filled the streets of mid-19th century New York. Meanwhile, the servants, they usually just entered through a separate door down on the ground floor. Moving right along to part 2, tenements and the dumbbell plan.
Now, if we shift our focus to the working class and immigrants, we enter the era of the tenement. Early versions were basically laid out like a train car. To get to the back bedroom, you literally had to walk directly through every single other room. Privacy was basically non-existent, and the conditions, incredibly grim. You'd have entire families of 6 or 8 people crammed into 1 or 2 completely windowless, airless rooms. It was terrible. It actually took Jacob Riis's famous exposé, How the Other Half Lives, to force a change. A 1901 law finally mandated natural light, air, and plumbing. So developers responded by carving out these narrow air shafts, creating the dumbbell plan you can see here. And they installed toilets, though, to be clear, it was 1 shared toilet for every 20 people. Which brings us to one of the most famously bizarre architectural quirks of historic New York apartments. If you ever walk into an old, unrenovated tenement unit today, you're probably going to stop and say, why on earth is there a bathtub right smack in the middle of the kitchen? Well, the answer is purely practical. These apartments were way too tiny to carve out space for a proper, separate bathroom. And since the kitchen already had a sink, it was the only room that had any existing plumbing. So it just made the most financial sense to drop the bathtub right next to the kitchen sink. People got pretty creative with it, too. Residents would build these elaborate wooden covers for the tubs so they could double as kitchen counter space during the day, and they'd only take the cover off when it was finally time to take a bath.
Part 3. Elevators bring the classic 6. So while the tenements housed the working class, a completely new paradigm was emerging for the wealthy in the 1920s, the famous Classic 6 layout. You had a main living room, a separate formal dining room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a maid's room. But what's really fascinating here is the stark socioeconomic contrast that is literally baked into the floor plan.
The kitchens in these massive grand apartments, they were actually tiny. And that's because the wealthy families never set foot in them, only the live-in maid did. The maid also had her own dedicated staff bathroom, while the entire rest of the wealthy family usually shared just one. Oh, and you'll notice almost no closet space. Even the super wealthy in the 1920s just owned way fewer clothes than we do today. Now, a crucial point here is how these apartments physically got built so high in the first place. It was all thanks to one massive technological leap: the elevator. Before the elevator, 6 stories was the absolute physical limit for a walk-up building. I mean, nobody wants to walk up 7 flights of stairs. But elevators totally transformed real estate. They allowed developers to build 10 to 15-story multi-unit towers, inventing a whole new style of high-rise living. But here's the catch. These 1920s buildings had amazing steam heating, but air conditioning didn't exist yet. And that is exactly why, even in these gorgeous multi-million-dollar historic apartments today, you still see those clunky window AC units sticking right out of the facades.
All right, part 4, manufacturing to elite lofts. This is really our main focus today. And honestly, it's arguably the most dramatic, fascinating architectural transition in the city's entire history. This transition is just a brilliant masterclass in how city real estate constantly reinvents itself from the ground up. The absolute epicenter of this phenomenon is Soho, which, by the way, just stands for south of Houston Street. Now, back in the late 1800s, this neighborhood was defined by these stunning cast iron buildings. Cast iron was a cutting-edge technology back then, and it allowed architects to build with massive, heavy sheets of glass. These giant windows were perfectly designed to flood those wide-open, rough floors with natural light. And that was exactly what you needed for a bustling industrial manufacturing space before widespread electric lighting. But as the 20th century rolls on, manufacturing largely packs up and leaves Manhattan. So you have these massive, light-filled factories just sitting there vacant and empty. Landlords were clueless about what to do with them. Enter the artists. In the mid-20th century, the art world was shifting. Painters weren't just working on little easels, they were creating massive wall-sized paintings. So these huge, abandoned, rough-around-the-edges manufacturing floors, they were an absolute dream. Landlords were just thrilled to collect any rent at all, so this vibrant, bohemian community was born. But you can probably guess what happens next. The artists fix up the spaces, trendy art galleries move in to sell the work, and the neighborhood becomes incredibly desirable. By the 1990s, folks with immense wealth realized that these raw lofts made for incredible, unique living spaces. So they moved in, bought everything up, and ironically priced out the very artists and galleries that made the neighborhood so cool in the first place. And this scrappy history is brilliantly illustrated by what those early artists actually had to do. Before the extreme wealth arrived, the artists had to literally build the infrastructure themselves. They took these raw, freezing factory floors and installed their own plumbing and heating. Crucially, they had to lobby the state government up in Albany to change the zoning laws just so they could legally live in spaces that were still officially zoned for commercial manufacturing. They had to register with the state, and they had to hang these signs right outside their doors that read AIR, Artist in Residence. And that wasn't some cool vanity plate. It was literally to alert the fire department that human beings were secretly sleeping inside these commercial factory buildings in case a fire broke out at night. So today, the demographic of Soho has completely flipped. It's now populated by very wealthy residents and high-end luxury shops. But the evolution hasn't stopped. Currently, the city is actually discussing rezoning Soho yet again. The city's proposed goal here is to allow for new building developments to create more inclusive, affordable housing in what's become a highly exclusive area. However, many current residents are pushing back hard. Their argument is that new developments will destroy the beautiful, historic, cast-iron character of the neighborhood. Now, observers also note there's likely a secondary, perhaps more financial motivation at play. Some residents are concerned that increased density and new housing could cause their elite property values to go down. So it's a really complex, modern debate unfolding right now over the exact same spaces that were once just abandoned, empty factories.
Finally, part 5, the surprising origin of studios.
It's so funny how real estate terminology evolves to cater to changing demographics. We hear the term studio apartment all the time today, right? And we instantly picture a tiny, affordable, single-room efficiency unit where your bed, your living room, and your kitchen are all just crammed into one tight space. But historically, the term meant the exact opposite. Back in the late 1800s, super-rich families built these lavish, double-height, massive Gothic spaces, like the famous Hotel des Artistes near Central Park, specifically for their children to use as literal art studios. Over time, as modern developers started building those tiny single-room apartments of just a few hundred square feet, they realized they needed a clever way to market them.
So they totally co-opted the word studio. They took a term that was associated with grand, wealthy, bohemian artist spaces and slapped it onto tiny efficiency rooms just to give them a romantic, cool flavor. So from dodging horse manure on stoops, hiding bathtubs in kitchens, to watching abandoned factories transform into some of the most expensive real estate on Earth, our apartments really are living monuments to urban history. They're shaped by the rigid math of the grid, by new laws, by technology, and by the constant push and pull of the people who call them home. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder as we look at the shifting landscapes of our modern cities today. What will today's abandoned or shifting urban spaces, like empty office buildings or struggling suburban malls, become in 50 years? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you look at your own walls just a little bit differently today.